Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True. Today is Friday, the 17th day of February, that is, 2023. I'm going to be sharing some information from Edward Bernays, his classic tale or classic book called Propaganda. And the chapter I'm going to go through is chapter 4, what we call the psychology of public relations. So hopefully you guys can sit back and relax, enjoy the talk about Edward Bernays, who is a key figure. A lot of things. He's the foundation part. A lot of it has to do with um, Orwell. Others have to do with what I call Brave New World with Austrius Huxley. I think they're all connected in many ways. So let's get to the point here. Let's read this book and get to the point too. The psychology of public relations. The systematic study of mass psychology revealed to students and the potentialities of individual government of society by manipulation of the motives which act in man in the group. Trotter and Laban, who approached the subject in a scientific manner, and Graham Wallas, Walter Lippmann, and others who continue with searching studies in the group mind, established that the group had mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual and is motivated by impulses and emotions which cannot be explained on the basis of what we know of individual psychology. So the questions naturally arose. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is not possible to control regiment the mass. It is not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it. Interesting comment there, isn't it? In other words, basically, he's basically already stating what his objective is to control others. The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least up to a certain point, within certain limits. Mass psychology is as yet far from being an exact science, and the mystery of human motivations are by no means are revealed. But at least theory and practice have combined with sufficient success to permit us to know that in certain cases we can effect some changes in public opinion with a fair degree of accuracy by operating a certain mechanism, just as the motorist can regulate the speed of his car by manipulating the flow of gasoline. Propaganda is not a science in the laboratory sense, but it is no longer entirely the empirical affair that it was before the advent of study of mass psychology. It is now scientific in the sense that it seeks to base its operations upon definite knowledge drawn from direct observation of the group mind and upon the application of principles which have been demonstrated to be consistent and readily constant. The modern propagandist studies systematically and objectively the material with which he is working in the spirit of the laboratory. If the matter's hand, if the matter in hand is a nationwide sales campaign, he studies the fields by means of a clipping service or a corps of scouts or by personal study point. He determines for which features of product are losing their public appeal and what direction the public taste is varying. He will not fail to investigate to what extent it is his wife who has the final word in the choice of her husband's car or of his suits and shirts. Scientific accuracy of results is not to be expected because many of the elements of the situation must always be beyond his control. Lost my place here. He may know with a fair degree of certainty that under favorable circumstances, as international flight will produce a spirit of goodwill, making possible even the consummation of political programs. But he cannot be sure that some unexpected event will overshadow this flight in the public interest, or that some other aviator may not do something more spectacular the day before. Even is even in his restricted field of public psychology, there must always be a wide margin of error. Propaganda, like economics and sociology, can never be exact science for the reason that its subject matter, like theirs, deals with human beings. If you can influence the leaders, either with or without their consciousness cooperation, you're automatically influencing the group which they sway. But men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be subject to the influences of mass psychology. Because man is by nature gregarious, he feels himself to be members of a herd even when he is alone in his room with the curtains drawn. His mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on it by the group influencers. A man sits in his office deciding what stocks to buy. He imagines, not doubts, that he is planning his purchases according to his own judgment. In actual fact, his judgment is Milan of impressions stamped on his mind by outside influences which unconsciously control his thoughts. He buys a certain railroad stock because it was in the headlines yesterday, and hence it is the one which comes most prominently to his mind, because he's a pleasant recollection of a good dinner on one of his last trains, because it is a liberal labor policy, a reputation for honesty, because he has been told that J.P. Morgan owns some of these shares, you see. Trotter and LeBon concluded that the group mind does not think in the strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits, and emotions. The making of his mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This is one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology. It operates in establishing the rising and diminishing prestige of a summer resort, and causing a run on a bank or a panic on the stock exchange, in creating a bestseller or a box office success. But when the example of the leader is not at hand, and the herd must think for itself, it does so by means of cliches, pad words, or images which stand for a whole group of ideas or experiences. Not many years ago, it was only necessary to tag a political candidate with the word interests to stampede millions of people into voting against him. Because anything associated with the interests, seeming necessary, corrupt. Recently, the word Bolshevik has performed a similar service for persons who wish to frighten the public away from a line of action. By playing upon an old cliche or manipulating a new one, the propagandists can sometimes swing a whole massive group of emotions. In Great Britain, during the war, the evacuation hospitals came in for a considerable amount of criticism because of the summary way in which they handled their wounded. It was assumed by the public that a hospital gives prolonged and conscientious attention to its patients. When the name was changed to evaluation posts, the critical reaction vanished. No one expected more than an adequate emergency treatment from an institution so named. The cliche hospital was indelible, associating the public mind with a certain picture. To persuade the public to discriminate between one type of hospital and another, to disassociate the cliche from the picture it evoked, would have been an impossible task. Instead, a new cliche automatically conditions the public emotions towards these hospitals. Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivates their actions. A man may believe that he buys a motor car because, after careful study of the technical features of all makes on the market, he has concluded that this is the best. He is almost certainly fooling himself. He bought it perhaps because a friend whose financial acumen he respects bought one last week, or because his neighbors believe he was not able to afford a car of that class, or because its colors are those of his college fraternity. It is chiefly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which have been obliged to suppress. A thing may be desired not for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see it in a symbol of something else, the desire for which he is ashamed to admit to himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for a purpose of locomotion, whereas the fact may be that he would really prefer not to be burdened with it and would rather walk for the sake of his health. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position, evidence of his success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife. This general principle that men are very largely actuated by motives which they conceal from themselves is as true as a mask as of individual psychology. It is evident that the success propagandists must understand the true motives and not be content to accept the reasons which men give for what they do. It's not sufficient to understand only the mechanical structure of society, the groupings and cleavage and the loyalties. An engineer may know all about the cylinders and pistons of a locomotive, but unless he knows how steam behaves under pressure, he cannot make his engine run. Human desires are the steam which makes the social machine works. Only by understanding them can the propagandists control that vast, loose-jointed mechanism which is modern society. The old propagandist based his work on the mechanical dissonance reaction of psychology, then in vogue in our colleges. This assumed that the human mind was merely an individual machine, a system of nerves and nerve centers, I should say, reacting with mechanical regulatory stimuli, like a helpless will-less automation. It was the special pleader function to provide the stimulus which would cause the desired reaction in the individual purchaser. It was one of the doctrines of the reaction psychology that a certain stimulus, when repeated, would create a habit, or that the mere reinterpretation of an idea would create a conviction. Suppose the old type salesmanship acting for a meat packer was seeking to increase the sale of bacon. It would reiterate numerously times in full-page advertisement: eat more bacon. Eat bacon because it is cheap, because it is good, because it gives you reserve energy. The newer salesmanship understands the group structure of society and principles of mass psychology. We're first asked, who is it that influences the eating habits of the world? The answer obviously is the physicians. The new salesman would then suggest to a physician to say publicly that it is wholesome to eat bacon. He knows as a mathematical certainty that large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he understands the psychological relations of dependency of men upon their physicians. That needs to be changed, folks. We don't need to be following doctors anymore. We are the authority. We have to take care of our bodies ourselves, you see. Continue. The old-fashioned propagandists, using almost exclusively the appeals of the printed word, try to persuade the individual reader to buy a definite article immediately. This approach is exemplified in a type of advertising which used to be considered ideal from the point of view of directness and effectiveness. You, perhaps with a finger pointing at the reader, buy O'Leary's rubber heels now. The advertiser sought by means of reiteration of emphasis directly upon the individual to break down or penetrate sales resistance. Although the appeal was aimed at 50 million persons, it was aimed at each as an individual. The new salesmanship has found it possible by dealing with men in the mass through their group formations to set up psychological and emotional currents which will work for him. Instead of assaulting sales resistance by direct attack, he is interested in removing sales resistance. He creates circumstances which will swing emotional currents so as to make for the purchaser demand. If, for instance, I want to sell pianos, it is not sufficient to blanket the country with a direct appeal such as, you buy a Mozart piano now, it is cheap. The best artists use it. It will last for years. That's kind of choppy, isn't it? The claims may all be true, but they are in direct conflict with the claims of another piano manufacturer and in direct competition with the claims of a radio or a motor car, each competing for the consumer dollar. What are the true reasons the purchaser is planning to spend his money on a new car instead of on a new piano? Because he has decided he wants the commodity called locomotion more than he wants a commodity called music. Now, altogether, he buys a car because it is, at that moment, the group accustomed to buy cars. The modern propagandist, therefore, sets to work to create circumstances which will modify their customs. He appeals perhaps to the home instinct, which is fundamental. He will endeavor to develop public acceptance of the idea of a music room in the home. This he may do, for example, by organizing an exhibition of pure music rooms designed by well-known decorators who themselves exert an influence on the buying group. He enhances the effectiveness and the prestige of these rooms by putting in them rare and valuable tapestries. Then, in order to create dramatic interest in the exhibit, he stages an event or ceremony. To this ceremony, key people, persons known to influence the buying habits of the public, such as a famous violinist, popular artist, and a social society leader, are invited. These key These key people affect other groups, lifting the idea of the music room to a place in the public consciousness which it did not have before. The juxtaposition of these leaders and the idea which they are dramatizing are then projected to the wider public through various publicity channels. Meanwhile, influential architects have been persuaded to make the music room an intricate architectural part of their plans, with perhaps a specific charming niche in one corner for the piano. Less influential architects will, as a matter of course, imitate what is done by the men whom they consider masters of their profession. They, in turn, will implant the idea of the music room in the mind of the general public. The music room would be accepted because it has been made the thing, and the man or woman who has a music room or has arranged a corner of the parlor as a musical corner will naturally think of buying a piano. It will come to him as his own idea. Under the old salesmanship, the manufacturer says to the prospective purchaser, please buy a piano. The new salesmanship has reversed the process and caused the prospective purchaser to say to the manufacturer, please sell me a piano. The value of associate process to propaganda is shown in connection with a large real estate development. To emphasize that Jackson Heights was socially desirable, every attempt was made to produce this associate process. A benefit performance of the Jenny players was staged for the benefit of earthquake victims of Japan under the auspices of Mrs. Oster and others. The social advantages of the place were projected. A golf course was laid out and a clubhouse planned. When the post office was opened, the public relations counselor attempted to use it as a focus for national interest and discovered that its opening fell coincidentally with a date important in the annals of the American Postal Service. This was then made the basis of the opening. When an attempt was made to show the public the beauty of the apartments, a competition was held among interior decorators for the best furnished apartment in Jackson Heights. An important committee of judges decided this competition drew the approval of well-known authorities as well as the interest of millions who were made cognizant of it through newspaper, magazines, and other publicity with the effect of building up definitely the prestige of the development. One of the most effective methods is the utilization of the group formation of modern society in order to spread ideas. Example of this is the nationwide competitiveness for sculpture in ivory soap. Open to school children in certain ages, groups as well as professional sculptors, a sculpture of national reputation found ivory soap an excellent medium for sculpture. The Procter & Gamble Company offered a series of prizes for the best sculpture in white soap. The contest was held under the auspices of the Art Center in New York City, an organization of high standards in the art world. School superintendents and teachers throughout the country were glad to encourage the movement as the educational aid for schools. Practice among school children as part of their art courses was stimulated. Contests were held between school districts, and cities. Ivory soap was adapted for sculpturing in the homes because mothers saved their shavings and their imperfect efforts for laundry purposes. The work itself was clean. The best pieces are selected from the local competition for entry in the national contest. This is held annually at an important art gallery in New York, whose prestige was that of the distinguished judges and established the contest as a serious art event. In the first of these national competitions, about 500 pieces of sculpture were entered. In the third was 2,500, and in the fourth, more than 4,000 pieces. If the carefully selected pieces were so numerous, it's evident that a vast number were sculptured during the year and that a much greater number must have been made for practice purposes. The goodwill was greatly enhanced by the fact that this soap had become not merely the concern of the housewife, but also a matter of personal and intimate interest to her children. A number of familiar psychological motives were set in motion in the carrying out of this campaign. The Athletica, the competition, the gregarious, much of the sculpturing was done in school groups, the snobbishy, that is the impulse to follow the example of a recognized leader, the exhibitors, and last but by no means least, the maternal. All these motives and group habits were put in a concerted motive by the simple machinery of group leadership and authority as it actually by the pressure of a button. people began working for the sake of the gratification attained in the sculptural work itself. This point is more important in successful propaganda work, you see. The leader who lend their authority to any propaganda campaign will do so only if he can be made to touch their own interests. There must be a disinterest aspect of the propagandist activities. In other words, it's one of the functions of the public relations council to discover at what points his client's interests coincide with those of other individuals or groups. In the case of the soap sculptural competition, the distinguishing artists and educators who sponsored the idea were glad to lend their services and their names because the competition really promotes an interest which they had at heart, the cultivation of the aesthetic impulses among the younger generation. Such coexistence and overlapping of interest in an infinite as the interlacing of group formation themselves. For example, a railway wishes to develop his business. The Council of Public Relations makes a survey to discover at what points its interests coincide with those of the prospective customers. The company then establishes relations with chambers of commerce among its right of way and assists them in developing their communities. It helps them to secure new plants and industry for the town. It facilitates business through the dissemination of technical information. It is not merely a case of bestowing favors in the hope of receiving favors. These activities of the railroad, besides creating goodwill, actually promotes growth on its right of way. The interests of the railroad and the communities through which it passes mutually interact and feed one another. In the same way, a bank institutes an investment service for the benefit of the customers in order that the latter may have more money to deposit with their bank, or a juror concerns developing an insurance development department to insure the jewels it sells in order to make the purchaser feel greater security in buying jewels, or a baking company establishes an information service suggesting recipes for bread to encourage new uses for bread in the home. The idea of the new propaganda predicated on sound psychology based on enlightened self-interest. I have tried in these chapters to explain the place of propaganda in modern American life and something of the method by which it operates, to tell the why, the what, the who, and the how of the invisible government which dictates our thoughts, directs our feelings, and controls our actions. In the following chapters, I shall try to show how propaganda functions in a specific department of group activity to suggest some of the further ways in which it may operate. So that concludes chapter 4. I'm going to take a little short break, and we'll hopefully get back to this particular book tonight. Again, this is a work by Edward Bernays called Propaganda. He wrote many books. He's also connected, as far as I know, with Freud and also with not Huxley. And I think Huxley, maybe it's Orwell. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, let me get a break here, and we'll be back in a little bit, and we'll continue to read this book. Thank you for being here. You take care.